All right, hello there, everyone. Welcome. Big warm welcome from Avid Reader, though we of course wish we were welcoming you onto our balmy deck this evening. So I hope you're all comfortable and enjoying yourselves. Now I'm just going to get us started. So welcome to this very special book launch this evening for I Am the Sand with Susan Fuss and Cynthia Armstrong. My name is Bianca, and I'll be your Avid Reader event host tonight. It is my absolute pleasure to welcome you all. Now, firstly, if you haven't attended an online event with Avid Reader before, I'll just briefly reiterate a couple of things that were sent on email with the link you received. Now, there is a chat function built into Zoom that you can use to communicate directly with your host, myself. And when we call for audience questions, this is where you can type them in and I can read them out loud to our authors. Now, please feel free to send through questions at any time, but I'll do a call out around about quarter past 7. One important note I'll pass on shortly in the chat is the link to where you can purchase your copy of I Am the Sand. For the next 24 hours, you can use the code EVENT, that's just EVENT, and receive 10% off any books you order online with Avid Reader. So for the tech side of things tonight, because everyone's computer or device will have different settings, we unfortunately can't offer technical support because there's just me. But please note that you're placed on mute for the conversation and the Q&A section. And at the end, I'll allow everyone to unmute yourselves so you can join in thanking our special guest speaker. Just got someone waiting. There we go. I'll let you in. So to officially start our event tonight, I would like to do an acknowledgement of country. Please join me from wherever you may be to acknowledge the traditional custodians of the land. From where I call home, Meanjin or Brisbane, I pay respect to the Yagara and Turrbal people and to all elders past, present and emerging. In the theme of NAIDOC 2020, I also acknowledge this land has always been and will always be a place of creativity, community, and storytelling. Now, I'd like to introduce you to our special guests this evening. Susan Fuss is a school teacher. She lives in Toowoomba in Queensland and has adult children not too far away. Susan was born in Zimbabwe and met and married David while they were both teaching in London. She loves Australia, nature and animals, and has a deep and abiding interest in human behaviour. As she gets older, she occasionally feels more enlightened, but far more frequently more bewildered. You can find out more about Susan at susanfuss.com, and that's Fuss. And also joining Susan in conversation is Cynthia. Cynthia Armstrong and Sue have known each other for 25 years. Cynthia was born in the United States and moving to Australia was headmistress of a school in Western Australia. Ever since, she has taught art classes from kindergarten to university students. Her real passion is sculpture, which she hopes to pursue once she retires. So please put your hands together. So we'll do some of these. A very warm Avid Reader welcome to Susan and Cynthia. And just before we hand over to start our in conversation, I would just like to throw over here to Joshua Clifton, who is the marketing coordinator of Ocean Reef Publishing, who would just like to say a few words before we begin. Over to you, Joshua.
Thanks so much. So at Ocean Reef Publishing, we have a book marketing mentorship program where we give authors the option to work one-on-one with myself or Ocean to help market their book in the best possible way. And I had the absolute pleasure to be working with Susan through this whole process with her book over the last 3 to 4, maybe even 5 months. It's been quite some time. And what takes an author to do amazing things is passion and commitment. And Susan embodies both of these so well. And it's not just through her work, but it's through her story that she tells as well. It's a very powerful story, and the way that it's a different take on a very powerful, sensitive topic. And it's written so well with her experience and background. It's been been incredible to not just learn about Susan to help her market her book, but learn about what she writes about. In my opinion, she's meant to be a writer. She always has been, and this book is a real powerful statement that really backs that up. So we're really proud of her, and we're really excited to be here and support her on her book day launch.
Wonderful. Thank you so much, Joshua, and it's a pleasure to have you along tonight. I hope you can stay for the event, but yeah, I'll now be passing over to Cynthia, and as our questionnaire person tonight.
Hello. Hi. Sue, this is your first published book. It's a psychological thriller. Can you tell me, why did you choose this genre?
Yes, well, I think it actually chose me. It was the other way around, because to start off with, I had the seed of a story, a scene in my head, and that involved Chloe, who's the heroine of the story, the protagonist, and she was locked in a cellar with a man who was her abductor. So she was facing the situation of total terror, and I was imagining what was going through her head. Once that had been established, then I had to think a bit more about the abductor and what he was doing. But Chloe was stuck in the cellar. And once I'd sort of finished with that in my head, I had to get her out of there. So I began to develop a loose narrative, a structure for the story. And once that happened, then of course, it had to be a psychological thriller.
Just
and
took
so
off.
The story grew.
Oh, right. Okay, good. Well, I have heard it described that I Am the Sand is a tough read. Why would you describe it a tough read?
Yes, I think because it deals with confronting topics, and the topics are disturbing and affect probably many more people than most of us realize. So that's trauma and PTSD. And, Dame Quentin Bryce
Yes.
described domestic violence as a scourge in our society. And she is so passionate about this. She's the patron of many organizations to combat domestic violence. And she says that it's not going to end until we actually stand up, be bold, have courage, and confront it. And, instead of once a week hearing that somebody has been murdered, usually a woman, 9 times out of 10, at the hands of a man, her domestic spouse. And that's not to say that men don't suffer domestic violence as well, but, the large majority are women. And, she says, stop to consider. We don't think about all the women who are damaged, who may not be murdered, but who are actually maimed or injured, sometimes the most horrific injuries for life. And, that this just has to stop, because we can no longer tolerate this in our society. It's absolutely appalling. And, when someone lives in terror and experiences trauma, it's a very long, hard road back. And it takes a very long time. Those effects are there forever, really. So, even in the best of recovery situations. And sometimes the memories lie deeply buried, and the person who has suffered this sort of trauma doesn't even realize until something triggers the memory, often years later when they're adult. And maybe a little sliver of memory is triggered, and then everything comes cascading back. Or maybe not cascading, but things start being remembered. And this has a very disturbing effect upon people. And not only upon the person who's suffering the effects of the trauma, the survivor, but also upon, their friends and their loved ones and all the people around them. So these ripple effects that keep expanding in circles from that one person. And, there is such a thing as have you heard of ACEs, Cynthia? Yes. So, these are adverse childhood experiences. And we know from the original one done in 1995 in the States, and then subsequent ones that have been mirrored around the world, that childhood adversity, and if we can sort of not talk so much about trauma, but let's call it childhood adversity, has really very, very important effects on the development of a child in the very early years. So if this happens from 0 to 5, when the brain is just exploding in its development, then the consequences can be dire, and the child can experience not only that psychological damage, but also physical damage, which has implications for health outcomes much later into life. And
Yes.
so that's the point, that these adverse experiences impact one's physical health much later on. And they've found that all sorts of issues like heart disease, the major cause of death in the States still, you are more likely, and I can't remember the statistics, but let's say, twice as likely, and I think it's more than that, likely to contract heart disease if you have had any of these adverse childhood experiences.
That's interesting.
Yeah. So, you're at risk of dying earlier, at risk of developing cancer, more at risk of that. And so it's absolutely vital. And I think that, we need to just realize that this is a real health issue facing the world, really. It's not just poverty-stricken nations, it's across the globe. And the original study was done between 1995 and 1997 in the States, across 25 states. And the group was over 17,000 people. Now, over those 2 years, they had 10 categories of questions that they were asking people about. So these included abuse, physical, sexual, and emotional, neglect, emotional and physical neglect, and then what they called household challenges. So these were things like, were you living with someone in your household who had experienced maltreatment at the hands of a spouse? So that would be usually the mother. Had there been a separation or a divorce? Was somebody incarcerated in jail? Was somebody a substance abuser? So these were the sort of original questions and categories. And if you were part of the surveyed group, then you scored 1 point for each of those adverse experiences that you ticked off in the study. And they found that 67% of that 17,000 strong group had suffered 1 ACE. And 1 in 8 people had suffered 4 or more.
Gee.
So that's amazing, isn't it?
It is.
That means that it's, it is very, well, one thing, it's very more widespread than we might imagine. And the other thing they found out was that, a lot of people, when the findings came out, said, oh yes, well, the reason that these people have poor physical health outcomes later on in life is because, if you do suffer poverty, neglect, you witness abuse, you have childhood trauma, you are more likely to indulge in what some of the people who research this call bad behaviors. So you are more likely to numb yourself and become a substance abuser yourself, or to smoke, or drink excessively, or become violent. But they said this is absolutely not the case, because instead of that cohort in the 17,000 people surveyed coming from the lower socioeconomic groups and postcodes across the States, 70% of those people were Caucasian and 70% were college educated.
Gee.
So,
wow. Yes, that's interesting, isn't it?
Yes, because, that's
Sorry, Susan. Sorry, I accidentally put you on mute for a second. I was just letting someone into the room. That was my error. I accidentally pressed yours instead. So you just need to unmute yourself there. Sorry, everyone. Won't be a second. There you go. Try that for me now. Just try unmuting yourself for me again.
Press unmute.
There we go.
There we go. You're right now?
Yes.
Thanks, Bianca.
Yes. So sorry. Thanks.
So I think I was just talking about the fact that, you know, these
Well,
ACE,
widespread,
the ACE
yeah.
studies are so widespread and so have such important implications. And so once we think about the story, I Am the Sam, you know, that those themes of trauma and adversity are tough for many people to read about because of the triggering and so on, and the fact that they often, if they're not a survivor, they know people who are. So I think that's why it's a tough read.
Oh,
And
okay,
it's not a comforting or uplifting read, but at the same time, I think, you know, that's where the thriller part and the suspense part come in, because
Yes.
it has been described as a tense and gripping
yes.
story. So
Yes,
I'm hoping
yes.
that that'll
Yes.
overcome, you know.
I am part of the way through it, and I'm really getting that tense feeling.
Oh,
so,
good, Cynthia.
yes, yes.
That's lovely.
Well, can you tell us a little bit more about the characters in your book?
Yes, I will. The main character, Chloe, is a 16-year-old girl. She is leading a very average life. She comes from a good home background, and she spends a lot of time with her friends. The other main character is the abductor, Henry Peters, and he is a soldier. And unfortunately, he's led a hideous life in his childhood, where he had to deal with all sorts of issues and adversity himself. And I don't really want to give away too much of that. But as a soldier, he's also experienced combat trauma in Afghanistan. So he's a man with a lot of issues. And so for a long time, these were the only two characters I had in the book. But then as the story started to develop, I created a handful of other characters to push the story along. And that was fun. I quite enjoyed doing that because those characters were fairly normal, leading
Yes.
fairly normal lives. And their stories were, gave some sort of, acted as a foil to what was happening in that very dark, intense cellar.
Yes.
And one of them, in fact, I had a lot of fun creating, was a quirky, eccentric aunt of ours who turned into the neighbor, who plays quite a central part later on. And so I had a lot of fun creating those people. And that was far easier to do than trying to get into the scenes in the cellar with Chloe and Henry Peters, where it was all about emotion and thoughts and what might have been happening inside the minds of both of those.
Oh, good. Well, also, look, in your book, you explore the themes of trauma and PTSD. So where did this interest come from?
Good question. Well, you know, I've always been interested in the extremes of human behavior. I just find it fascinating. It's not a macabre interest. It's just I just find it extraordinarily interesting. And for example, let's take something like OCD, obsessive compulsive behavior.
Okay. Yes.
For
yes.
example.
Mm-hmm.
Well, I think all of us sit upon a continuum of behavior, and most of us are happily in the middle of that continuum, but sometimes some of us sit out at the edges, at the extremes, and it's at that place, those places where the behavior becomes troubling to us. And so with OCD, you know, most of us like to have a pattern of behavior where we can control some issues and events in our lives, but that's because that's a good thing. We like to have control over our routines and our, you know, a lot of things we can control in our lives, because that's an efficient and more effective way to lead our lives. But at one end of that continuum with OCD, you have very impetuous, spontaneous behavior where people are very much out of control and everything is slightly dysfunctional. So that's not an easy way to live either. You're disinhibited and dysregulated. At the other extreme, of course, is the very strong self-controlling behavior that leads you to say inside your head that you need to perform certain routines and rituals, like walking backwards through doorways, the one we all know about, hand washing,
Yes.
constantly, a fear of germs. You know, I read about somebody who in the newspaper would, if they read something that had a connotation of death or sadness, had to find 7 words to counteract each of those words.
Yes. Yes.
To before they could go on and feel happy with their lives. Now, often this happens in private, and often even a spouse doesn't know about it. It's a very internal thing. But once that becomes disruptive in one's life, then that's the point when a diagnosis is made. And so that is those are the issues. And, you know, I think that these things are actually very interesting, because there, for the grace of God, go all of us. You know,
Yes,
I think
yes.
it's
Just thinking back.
I think we're all a little bit OCD, you know, like
Yes.
I line my things up on the desk a little bit and I think, oh no, and I mess it up a little bit after that because I don't want to think that I'm going down that path.
Yeah.
But no, jokes aside, you know, these things are very disruptive in people's lives. And I found it all very interesting. And because I wanted to learn more, I did a diploma in counseling at one point, because I thought, you know, and I did learn a lot more. And I found that after that, all my reading became about psychology and these sorts of accounts and stories about that.
Well, that sort of leads me into the next question. I was going to ask you, what sort of research did you do to write this book regarding the trauma and PTSD? So yes, the counseling sort of obviously came into it.
It did.
Yes.
And then I started to understand, the more I read, that trauma is also vicarious trauma, where you can suffer the effects, as I was alluding to earlier on. If a loved one or a family member suffers trauma, you're involved in that. And, you know, think about all the witnesses to trauma, people living in war zones, you know, first responders who come upon accidents, firefighters, medical workers, people who work in mental health, all of those people experience secondhand trauma and witness trauma, you know, coming upon terrible car accidents with fatalities and so on. Imagine doing that in the course of your week, how, you know, several times.
Yes, it would affect you. Yes,
frightful, isn't it?
Isn't
it must have a great effect. But anyway, I started reading accounts of survivors of these kind of traumatic events. So because Henry Peters was a soldier, I read quite a bit about combat trauma. And my brother helped me because he's an ex-soldier, and he sort of guided me a little bit about that. And also of survivors of kidnappings, because Chloe had been kidnapped. And, you know, I mean, do you remember Natasha Kampusch, who was kept in a cellar?
Yes,
in Austria for 8 years.
Yes, I remember.
And the cellar was made of reinforced steel and concrete. And this frightful man kept her there all that time and had his own wife.
Yes.
And she claimed that she didn't know what was happening. Well, I have to doubt that, I'm afraid. But, you know, then there was J.C. Dugard. Now, she was kidnapped in California.
I remember that.
She was kept for 18 years. She was abducted on the way to a bus stop at the age of 11 to go to school. And, you know, she, at the end of it all, she had 2 children. So, you know, this can just come out of the blue. It's quite alarming. And then the worst of all was Colleen Stan, who was also in California. She was a bit older. I think she was 20. She was going to visit somebody, and she was hitchhiking, and a man pulled up in the road and said, you know, we can give you a lift. Where are you going? And inside the car was his wife and a baby. So she thought, well, this was quite safe. It was, I think, in the 70s. And, you know, that was my era of growing up as well. And we always had warnings about hitchhiking, but we all did it. And so unfortunately, she landed up with, you know, in this home. And these two kept her often for some years for 23 hours a day in a box under a bed.
Oh,
can you imagine?
Yes, yeah.
And you know, what stories of courage and fortitude. You know, these people, and many of them have gone on to found organizations and have written books to help others to learn to come to terms with all of this. And so, you know, I think they are to be admired greatly. And my mind just boggles when I think about how the human spirit is just so resilient and so can come through these things.
What did you find the hardest scene to write, Sue?
Oh, Cynthia, all those in the cellar. They were frightful.
Yes.
They were hard because I originally did have this in my head, which is why I started writing it in the first place. But I don't know, somehow I was getting all my kind of angst about silly things, nothing like what I've been describing, of course, whatsoever, but in a very minor way. And so I imagined all of those. And, you know, I started with Chloe, as I said, and what was going on in her head. And then Peter's, I was determined he wasn't going to have a voice for a very long time. I didn't want him to speak, actually. And then I realized that the more I sort of had to include him, the more I kept saying to myself, what has happened to this man that has caused him to turn into this monster? Why has he become this type of a person? And then luckily I hit upon the sort of vehicle of using the counselor to reveal his backstory through. And that is how we start to learn about him. And she's a wonderful person, very empathetic and patient, but she doesn't let him off the hook.
Right.
So she's me,
good.
Of course.
Yes, of course. Yes, it would have to be you.
Of course.
Yes. Oh, good. What did you find difficult about the publishing process?
Did I say I found it difficult? No. You know, I only found it difficult because, in some ways, because I was so naive and had never done anything like this before. And I felt I was on a very steep learning curve. But I also felt that all the children whose work I'd marked over the decades had come back to haunt me and were wreaking their vengeance. And, you know, I knew what it felt like. But no, my publishers were wonderful and they guided me through this process. And, you know, I had 4 sets of eyes looking through my work and pointing out all the necessary mistakes and so on, which, you know, they got it from a very amateurish kind of script with no sense of sequence and timing and everything all over the place. I'm sure they tore their hair out. I know they did. They must have. And into something which was presentable. And I'm so grateful because I have really learned an amazing amount through it. So that's been a good process.
Oh, fantastic.
So thank you everyone at Ocean Reeve for helping me out. All of you, Josh, Marisa, Sarah, Ocean, Jason, and several other people. Yeah.
Sue, where did you grow up and what did you do before you arrived in Australia?
Well, I won't go into all those things, but I grew up in Zimbabwe, which was Rhodesia at the time, and I had a very happy childhood. It was a wonderful childhood. And then after university in South Africa, I went to work in London, well, in Switzerland first for a couple of years. And then I landed up in an international school in London, and that had a boarding arm in Switzerland. So I was so lucky I was able to travel up with the boys to Switzerland, which I absolutely loved. And we did various things, mountain climbing and walking, and some education interspersed in all of that. And while I was in London, I met an Australian and we got married. And we came back to, well, he came back and I came with him to Australia and landed up in Queensland.
Ah, interesting. All right. Well, after you came to Australia, 4 years after you were here with your husband and your children, you took a job teaching at a juvenile detention center, didn't you?
I did.
Yeah. What effect did that have on you at the time, or thinking back now too? What was it different from any other type of teaching you did?
Oh yes,
I can imagine.
Totally different. So I'll just give you a little bit of background about this. This was a detention center for boys under 17. So from the age of about 11 to 17, and juvenile offenders. And it was really the end of the road for them. So many of them had been involved in the criminal justice system and juvenile courts and so on for a very long time. And then there were a couple of boys who were older than that. They were 21 or 22 because they were sort of long-term prisoners. They'd been sentenced to what was then called Queen's Pleasure, which meant an indefinite sentence. So they were there. And on this, in this center, it was actually a bit out of town and it was a working farm. So the boys during the daytime, if they, depending upon the level of trust they had, which was determined by the manager and the psychologist and their childcare officers, they were allowed to go out to work on the farm or to work in the laundry or the kitchen and the mechanic shop. And so some of the officers worked in the sections looking after those boys, but then some were qualified carpenters and mechanics, really nice men who you know, guided these boys and taught them something. The idea being that when they got out, they had honed their skills or learned new skills. And the schoolroom was one of the places they could come to. So I was only allowed to have between 6 to 8 or so boys at a time, because for some of the time I was there, it was just me, in fact, for most of the time. For some of the time I had another female teacher with me, but the schoolroom and having a school was very new. And I suspect that the education department had been asked by the corrective services to supply a teacher, because, you know, these boys who would have been at school weren't, and they needed to be. And because many of them had been truanting from a very, very early age, they had missed out on a lot of literacy and numeracy. In fact, the reading levels were atrocious. So that was the main thrust of that. But it was really nice because I could devise my own curriculum. And we sat down together, the boys and the childcare officers and the psychologist and I, and we talked about what their sort of most immediate needs were. And we decided life skills. So, you know, learning to write a resume, how you go about applying for a job, and all of those sorts of things. Just basic things like reading a timetable,
right?
Using,
Yes.
you know, the phone book,
yeah.
Things like that. Some of them were fathers, in fact, although not in the true sense of the word, but they had fathered children in relationships they'd had with girls previously. And so we felt that we would, well, I got someone in from what was called Mothercraft at the time, and she came and taught them to change a baby's nappy, and not a real baby, but, you know, and so with the hope that when they went back, they could actually assist these girls and be more of a father to their children. But, you know, it was really, really very interesting. Often the whole sort of schooling was disrupted because I never knew who was going to be there when I got there in the morning out of those 6 or 8 boys. Sometimes they'd had bad news the afternoon before or during the evening, and that had put them in a bad mood. Maybe they'd caused a fight or been in a fight with somebody. Then they would be locked down in their sections and they weren't allowed to come out for their privilege of coming to school for a little while. Sometimes they'd had bad news at court. They would have been to court and then they were told, no, you're not eligible for parole. They say you're not ready, you need to stay longer. Or, you know, they had news via a telephone call that bad things had happened. Maybe their girlfriend had, no, I was with someone else. You know, you just never knew. There were all sorts of things that disrupted the whole process. So, you know, we just
They
picked
didn't
up
have
where
much
we
structure
left
then.
off.
They didn't have much structure.
No.
They could choose where they wanted to go.
You mean once they came to school?
Yes, yes.
Yes, they could, absolutely. We, you know, some days some would just want to come and sit quietly because it was a nice quiet space. We'd have music on, we'd do painting and drawing. In fact, you know, I didn't do very much teaching at all, actually, to be honest. We would sit, I would sit with the boys around a table like this, and we would do a lot of colouring in my children's colouring in books. And, you know, while that was happening, we bonded and talked. And I found that fascinating because that was where I learned a lot about their offending and the environments they'd come from, what they thought about schools. Many of them had injured teachers, and one had broken someone's arm, set fire to schools.
So they started opening up to you.
Yes.
Yes.
And
Trusting you.
yes, and there was a respect. So nothing really terrible happened in that schoolroom. The only time I had to press the button, there were panic buttons around the walls, was when somebody sharpened a pencil to a very, very sharp point and stabbed another boy in the back of the neck. And that was a bit awful. But, you know, I learned all about the sad childhoods they'd had and the fact that they had not had a primary caregiver for much of their very early childhoods. And we now know that the lack of a primary caregiver, who doesn't have to be a parent, can be, you know, grandmother or an aunt or an older brother, somebody who's there constantly and gives consistent care to this person from birth to 5 is so vital. And these boys, most of them had not had anybody. So they'd been shunted from pillar to post. Many had come from foster care homes. And, you know, I take my hat off to foster carers, but it's a tough gig for both them and for the kids.
Yes.
So we now know that, you know, with attachment theory, that bond of attachment needs to be established early on. And if it's not, then once again, the brain development doesn't happen as it should, and the child's language and physical development, all sorts of things are delayed and aren't attended to, and their ability to give and receive affection, you know, all of those things that happen when you have somebody who's looking after a child all the time can give them a place of refuge and safety. So, you know, it just made me more conscious of the fact that my husband and I had to work very hard to give our children safe and happy childhoods. And that is the main thing. You know, it doesn't matter about milestones and things. That what matters is that they're cared for and loved and they feel that. So, you know, it's just so crucial.
Oh, thank you. Thank you for sharing part of that insight with us. Now, we know you are very interested in domestic violence. How has the conversation of domestic violence started to change? Do you think it started to change?
Yes, definitely. Do you?
Yes. Absolutely.
Yeah,
yes.
I think so.
Yes.
You know, we talk about it so much more, especially in the last 10 years.
And men are starting to talk about it with men too.
Yes. And isn't that a good thing? Because, you know, I think in our patriarchal societies, and especially societies where men are asked to be, their identity is all bound up with being strong and
macho.
Yes, and not showing their softness and their vulnerability, and just hiding everything. To talk about your innermost feelings and your problems and your emotions is seen sometimes, not so much now, but definitely in the past, as being unmanly and not being, you know, a true man. So now I think instead of when we hear about domestic violence, and I'm talking about very severe domestic violence, we don't say, well, what did she do that made this happen? You know, the victim, it is not a question of what the victim did.
Mm.
It's a question of what the perpetrator did. And 9 times out of 10, that is a man.
Mm.
So it is a men's problem. And we need to find out why this is happening and go back and not, think, oh, well, women shouldn't walk home at night along roads on their own, even in the middle of the city centre. I mean, we remember something that happened in the middle of Melbourne, just because it was 1 o'clock in the morning. But
a few times, yeah.
Yes.
Several times.
Exactly. And, she scolds her husband, or, she's wearing inappropriate clothing. Well, it is not about that. It's about men being able to find a release and access mental health and access support groups for their rage. And somebody described it as the humiliated rage of men. And, none of them wake up in the morning and say, well, today I'm going to murder my wife. They, it's a build-up over sometimes many years. And you'll find that they've had AVOs taken out against them. They're known to police. There have been reports. But it just so sad that sometimes it doesn't happen in time that they get the help they need for whatever reason. Either they haven't reached out, or nobody has, they don't know where to go or what to do. And that violence could have been prevented. So I do think the conversation is changing. We're now sort of saying, well, what about the perpetrator? This is a man's problem if this is happening. It's not the victim's problem.
Sue, have you always loved reading?
Yes, I have. And, in Zimbabwe, my mum used to take all of us, 4 children, to the Mount Pleasant Library. And I remember in the children's section, the walls were painted yellow. It was such a lovely place, because in those days you could just lie on the carpet, pull out all the books you wanted, and we'd go home with all of these books that we, Enid Blyton and all those books that we used to read. And also in our home, there were always a lot of books, because both my parents were great readers too.
What a lovely memory. That's a lovely memory, isn't it? Yeah.
Yes,
yeah.
it is.
And what are you reading at the moment?
Oh, well, at the moment, and Bianca, you will have to stop me if I go on too much here, because I'm conscious of the time. But, at the moment, I'm reading a book called The Boy Who Was Raised as a Dog.
Yes.
By Bruce Perry. And so he's a psychiatrist in the States, and he's dedicated his life to helping children deal with their childhood trauma. And this is a collection of some of the most bizarre and dreadful cases that he's had to deal with. The boy who was raised as a dog, and his name is Justin, that's not his real name, but a series of incidents found him left with no mother, no grandmother, and in the care at 11 months of the grandmother's partner, who we'll call Arthur, who wasn't a malicious person, but obviously was slightly mentally retarded, and he was a dog breeder. And so when he went to work, he didn't quite know what to do with this toddler. And he did contact Child Protection Services, but the weeks turned into months, turned into years, and nothing was forthcoming. And because he didn't badger them, it was, I think, put on the back burner. And so Justin was left in a cage with dogs for 5 years during the daytime. And when Bruce Perry met him in hospital, he was crouched in the corner of a little cot, and he was smearing feces over the wall, throwing feces and food at the staff. And so, obviously they found it very difficult to deal with him. And Bruce Perry called in Arthur and said, tell me about this child's background. How have you been dealing with this little boy? And it all came out, and Arthur really didn't feel that he had done much else. He was just ignorant. He didn't know what to do. Had no experience of child rearing. Anyway, Bruce Perry dealt with this little boy in his, in his special way, which was, he was developing a model called neurosequential model of therapies. And this has now become very widely known, and he trains people to go and train other people. And there are therapists and medical people who, this is how they operate, psychologists, and this has become a very well-known mode of therapy. But yes, when Justin was 8, he was he'd caught up enough to be able to go to kindergarten, and then he hand drew and coloured in a little picture and wrote on the back of it, "Thank you, Dr. Perry," and sent it to Bruce Perry, who at that point cried, because he really had to take a leap of faith that this child wasn't damaged to the point where he couldn't catch up, and he was starting to catch up.
Oh, yes,
So,
it's wonderful.
yeah, quite amazing. And he said that all of these children he features in that book taught him about hope and courage and humanity. They taught him just as much as he helped them.
Well, without giving the ending away, Sue, can you tell us a little bit about, well, maybe not the ending, just tell us, is it a happy ending or not?
No, I'm sorry.
Eye in the Sand, is it a happy ending?
No, I have to say, in all honesty, I can't say it's a happy ending, but it's not, there is hope. That's what I'm saying. And it's not a comforting ending either, but because trauma takes so long to resolve, it couldn't all just be resolved at the end. So, you know, I think you'll have to read it.
Well, does that mean there'll be a sequel? Do you think so? There might be a sequel?
Well, I hope so. I mean, I do have that in my head, and it's swirling around at the moment. But before I go back to my publishers, I'm going to have to get it under some kind of control and actually start at the beginning and have a plan, which is what I always tell my children at school.
So there's more in there. Great.
Yes.
That's wonderful.
Yes.
Terrific.
I think that segues perfectly to a couple of the questions we've had, because we have had a few. So I just wanted to make sure, we've only got 10 minutes left and it goes so quickly, and I could just easily have sat here for another hour and just listened to you both, because it's just such a fascinating and important conversation, to have these types of conversations on these topics and to write about them. And I'm just, I've really enjoyed just hearing about your journey into writing, Susan. So thank you.
Thank you, Bianca. And thank you, Cynthia.
Thank you, Cynthia. Doing a marvelous job. It's just so the dynamic between you two is great. So I'm going to just go over to questions now. I'm mindful also that we want to fit in a reading as well from the book. So if we do have time for that, I will just start with a question. Now, the first one came from Marissa. And Marissa has asked, is there another book after this that might consider one or two of the many other facets of human behavior other than PTSD and trauma? For example, Susan, you mentioned OCD in your in the conversation earlier.
Yes. Hello, Marissa. Lovely to thank you for listening and looking. Marissa's my overall editor, so she's gone through this journey with me. And in fact, when I was ambivalent about the whole publishing process, she convinced me that there was a good message in the book and I should just go ahead and believe in myself and do it. So I'm so glad she did. I think maybe, I'm thinking about hoarding or, a few things that may be a little bit lighter.
Because come and visit me. Hoarding.
Yes, but no, definitely it'll be a psychological. I hope I can do another psychological thriller, and perhaps I can take my characters through and then introduce some other aspect, which will make it a little bit more interesting, I think.
Right. So it definitely sounds like a second book is something you've definitely thought about.
I would love to try that. Yes.
And Toby has asked, how can society balance the need for punishment of a perpetrator when the perpetrator themselves has suffered their own trauma? Thank you, Toby. That's a really good question.
It is a really interesting question. I don't know. I do believe that society has to be protected from people who become uncontrolled and their behavior is damaging and harmful to other people. But at the same time, they really need the support and help that they can get we're all human beings. We all need to be helped. And mental illness is something that is, if you have a broken leg or if you are suffering from cancer, you access physical health practitioners. And it's just the same with mental illness. We need that to be done. So, Toby, I really don't have an answer for that. I've thought about it, as I'm sure you have. And do you have an answer? I don't know. Do you have one, Cynthia?
No, I don't have an answer, but I certainly think we need more training. Human beings need more training. So you need more professional mental health nurses and doctors.
Yes.
And society in general, I think, just needs more training.
And, as teachers, the two of us, we know how, as Bruce Perry said, I was listening to him on YouTube the other day, and he said, we learn all sorts of things at school, but does anyone ever teach us about child rearing? Does anyone ever teach us what to do if we're not feeling well mentally?
Nobody teaches us how to look after our mental health or meditation in schools.
Or to bring up children, and how very important it is, this whole business of attachment. And, but that's one of our prime things that nearly all of us do. So it's extraordinary. But sorry, that's a bit off the topic.
No, not at all. I think I was just reflecting then very quickly. Also, I'm another part of my work is very much we're encouraged to take part in regular mental health first aid training, and I think that should be available more widely.
Definitely, definitely.
So thanks for that, Toby. So I've got a question from Joshua, and he would like to know, who do you think this book is best targeted for? Really good.
Oh, thanks, Josh. Yes, I think it's anybody who likes a gripping, suspenseful novel, because there's that aspect to it, and anyone who's interested in those sorts of things that I am, but really anybody. Everybody. I mean, if that's your cup of tea, then I do. I haven't really. I didn't set off to write a book or to have it published, so I wasn't targeting it at anyone. I was doing it more as a cathartic exercise for myself. So I just think, I think it's anybody really, and everybody, because I think some of those underlying themes are relevant to most of us.
And if I can just sort of add a little bit to that as well, I would just like to know, do you think there's an age limit as far as how young? That's another aspect I was thinking of it, because the protagonist Chloe is 16, isn't that right? So that also gives it. Yeah. No,
you're quite right, Bianca, and thank you for pointing that out. I think it is an adult read, actually, and it's not in the vein of L. James, who, 50 Shades of Grey or anything like that, but there is one fairly explicit scene in the cellar. And although I've tried to approach that from an emotional and cognitive point of view, especially what Chloe is thinking while this is happening, but it is obvious, I think, and it's more subtle. But yes, that was one of the reasons that I actually was a little bit worried about going down the publishing route, was that many of the children I've taught are still quite young, and I think parents should read the book first if they are very young, because I don't think it's material for juveniles. Do you agree?
I agree. Yes, totally.
And I don't think they'd be interested, to be honest.
And also more on the line of a marketing question, I suppose. So this last one's from Fiona. And a question I was sort of pondering too is about the title. How did you come up with the title? Is there a specific reference to sand, the symbolic sort of nature of it? We'd really love to know that too.
I know, I don't want to give that away, because I think it will become very, very evident as you read through it. But yes, it's a slightly, it's a little bit mysterious at the moment. But so thanks, Fiona. And if you're the Fiona I think you are, hello, and thank you very much. Trust you to pick up on that because it's something that is a bit more interesting. But no, I'm going to keep that to myself for the moment.
Intriguing. I do like that, finding out the title, through the reading of the book. We've got a couple of minutes left with you both. Now, would you like to take us out with a reading? Just a couple of minutes, and
Yes,
then
certainly. Will you tell me when to stop, Bianca?
I can, yeah, I'll give you a little wave when we're up to about 2 minutes, and then
Right.
we'll open up so everyone can do the.
All right, fine. This isn't very long anyway. So this is Chloe in the cellar, and she is experiencing terrible nightmares, and they get worse. So again, you don't know where this is in the story, and it's not really giving much away. It's just more of a description. Chloe can't imagine how many drawn out, lonely hours she has gazed at the faint glow coming in through the little window. She looks at that place 1,000,000 times a day. Now, just the early light penetrates enough to nourish the hope that she will get another chance to flee the cellar. Her only job is to be ready. She always feels relief as the light becomes more visible. Relief that the darkness is diluted, however little, because during the nights, in the brief bouts of light sleep she snatches from the terror, she's tormented by nightmares that will not allow her any respite. They begin where they leave off, and they're blacker and more frightening than she could ever have imagined. In the nightmares, Chloe is visited by increasing legions of appalling, macabre creatures. They creep and scuttle out from where they lurk and skulk in the recesses of her ears, her nostrils, her mouth and throat. Nests of vile scorpions, stinging tails held aloft, pinchers at the ready. They are joined by clusters of hirsute venomous spiders, and they all slink and steal in a heaving tide across the pitted landscape of her mind, eating into it on their way. She valiantly tries to smother them by throwing her black cloak over the orifices where the horrendous creatures breed and multiply, trying to deprive them of air, but to no avail. The rustling and rasping as they push past the cloak slowly grows to a crackling and a roaring. Dry skin glances against feelers and scales as they pass one another. Now the infestation has reached plague proportions. She is no match for them. She cannot stem the slithering sludge oozing out through her mouth and down her neck. Amid their roaring and their high-pitched hissing in her mouth, they await their opportunity to clamber out, to start stinging and piercing her. There are so many now that Chloe can only claw frantically at her neck, black with creatures, so that it bleeds. But no sooner does she crush some in her fist than another 20 appear in their place, leaving her almost hysterical with fear, while the sinister scourge spreads and slides relentlessly onto her soft breasts. The noises become louder, frantic as they jostle and quarrel, and the increasing tumult and pandemonium of the hisses wakes her up. She lies on the mattress, soaked in sweat, her heart pumping, her eyes squeezed tight shut.
Wow, thank you. I'm now going to allow everyone to unmute themselves in a moment, but so I could see clapping. I just wanted to hear more, and I assume that would definitely be a collective response from the audience too. So, look, thank you so much for hosting. Oh, sorry, I'm the host for launching your event and your book with Avid Reader. And Susan, I can only just say, I hope for the success of your book and the conversations that will be sparked from the story itself. It's been really inspiring. Thank you.
Thank you, Bianca, and good luck in your own endeavors. I really appreciate your easy manner and the way you've done this for us. Thank you so much. We were a bit nervous, weren't we?
We were a little bit nervous. Lovely meeting you.
And thank you, old friend, for doing this for me. And yes, lovely meeting you. Thank you, Josh, and thank you everybody who I know, family and friends who've been kind enough to join in. Thank you so much.
Wonderful. Well, everyone, please go out and support Susan with the launch of I Am the Sand. Susan Fuss. Check out the website as well at Ocean Reeve and the authors. And it's Christmas, well, just about. So, plenty of opportunity for buying those gifts, and what better gift to buy than the gift of reading. So I'll leave it there for tonight. Have a great evening. Lovely to meet you. And everyone can now unmute themselves, and we'll join in a clap.
Well done.
Well done, Susan.
Thank you very much.
No Okay. Take care.
Thanks, everyone.
Thank
Have a
you.
lovely night. Thanks.
Bye.
Thank you.
Bye.
Bianca. Bye.
See you soon. See you soon.
Bye. Bye, Josh.
Bye.
Oh, hi, Ian. How are you? Hello, Nina. Oh, lovely to see you.
See you soon.
See you soon.